The real estate agent's voice crackled through Mara Chen's phone like static through a dying radio. "I'm sorry, but there's really nothing I can do. The property sold this morning. Cash offer, no contingencies. You're being evicted in 30 days. Mara stood in the parking lot of Henderson Elementary, watching her daughter Zoe through the chain-link fence. The girl was 8 years old, playing foursquare with friends who didn't know their apartment was gone, their stability shattered, their future compressed into a single month of desperate searching. 30 days. Mara closed her eyes against the afternoon sun.
If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today.
30 days to find a new place in a market where landlords wanted first month, last month, security deposit, and proof you earned 3 times the rent. She made $20,400 a month as a bookkeeper. After taxes, that left maybe $1,900. Rent for a 2-bedroom in any safe neighborhood started at $1,800. The math didn't work. It never worked. Not since Daniel left 4 years ago with a text message that read, "I can't do this anymore," and no forwarding address. Not since Mara's mother died and left behind medical debt instead of inheritance. Not since the world decided single mothers were disposable, forgettable, deserving of nothing but struggle. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Mara almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Miss Chen, this is Patricia Whitmore from Whitmore and Associates in Portland. I'm calling regarding the estate of Thomas Chen." Mara's breath caught. Uncle Thomas, her father's older brother, the one who disappeared to the Oregon coast 35 years ago and never came back. Family legend said he'd gone crazy, become a hermit, died alone with nothing but debts and delusions. "I'm afraid your uncle passed away 6 weeks ago. As his only living relative, you've been named executor and sole beneficiary of his estate." "There is no estate." Mara's voice came out flat, exhausted. Uncle Thomas had nothing. Actually, he owned a property, an aquaculture farm on 47 acres in Tillamook County. It's been abandoned for approximately 15 years, and from what I understand, it's in severe disrepair, but it's yours if you want it. What's it worth? Patricia hesitated. "In its current condition, maybe $900 if you can find someone willing to take on the environmental cleanup. The tanks are leaking, the structures are condemned, and there are outstanding county fines for code violations. Honestly, Miss Chen, most people in your position would simply refuse the inheritance and let the county seize it. How much are the fines?" $37,000 and accumulating at $500 per month. Mara did the math in her head. She had $600 in her checking account. 30 days until eviction. A condemned property 3 hours north that was worth less than a used car and carried debt that would crush her. "I'll take it." Patricia's surprise was audible. "I'm sorry. The property, I'll take it. When can I get the keys?" The drive to Tillamook County took 4 hours through rain that turned the highway into a river of brake lights and anxiety. Zoe sat in the back seat of their 2009 Honda Civic, earbuds in, oblivious to the fact that they were fleeing toward disaster instead of away from it. Mara had packed everything they owned into the car and a small U-Haul trailer. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of kitchen supplies, Zoe's stuffed animals, photo albums that were all that remained of better times. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the life they'd built, she'd sold on Facebook Marketplace for $800. Combined with her $600 savings, that gave her $1,400 to survive on until she could find work. If the property was truly worthless, maybe she could sell the land itself. 47 acres had to be worth something, even if the structures were condemned. The GPS directed her off Highway 101 onto progressively smaller roads. Paved gave way to gravel, gravel to dirt, dirt to something that barely qualified as a path. Blackberry vines scraped the sides of the car, potholes threatened to swallow the tires. "Mommy, where are we going?" Zoe had pulled out her earbuds, her voice small and uncertain. "To see Uncle Thomas's farm. Is it nice?" Mara thought about Patricia's words. severe disrepair, environmental cleanup, condemned structures. I don't know, baby. We'll find out together. The property appeared suddenly, emerging from coastal fog like something from a nightmare. A massive gate hung crooked on rusted hinges, the chain that once secured it lying in the mud like a dead snake. Beyond it stretched rows and rows of concrete tanks, each one the size of a swimming pool, maybe 30 of them total, all filled with black water that looked more like oil than anything that could sustain life. The main building was a warehouse-style structure, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, its windows either broken or boarded. Smaller buildings dotted the property, all in similar condition. One had partially collapsed, its roof caved in by years of coastal storms. "Oh no," Zoe's voice trembled. "Mommy, this is scary. It's okay, baby. It's just old. We'll make it better." But Mara's hands shook as she guided the car through the broken gate. The wheels splashed through puddles that might have been water or might have been something worse. The smell hit them even through the closed windows, fish and rot and chemicals, the stench of death and decay. She parked in front of the main building and killed the engine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "Can we go back home?" Zoe whispered. "We don't have a home anymore, baby. This is it." Mara grabbed the keys Patricia had overnighted and approached the building's main entrance. The door was padlocked, but the lock was so rusted it crumbled when she applied pressure. The door swung open with a shriek of protesting metal. Inside was darkness and the overwhelming smell of mildew. Mara found a light switch and flipped it. Nothing happened. No power. Of course there was no power. The property had been abandoned for 15 years. She used her phone's flashlight to navigate. The building was massive, easily 10,000 square feet, divided into sections. Office space, processing rooms, storage areas, all filled with equipment that had corroded into abstract sculptures of rust and decay. "Mara, this is a terrible idea." The voice in her head sounded like her mother, always practical, always disappointed. "You should have refused the inheritance, taken your 1,400 and found somewhere to rent until you got back on your feet." But there was nowhere to rent. Not on 1,400s, not for a single mother with no references and a daughter who needed stability. They found the living quarters at the back of the building, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen, all surprisingly intact. The furniture was covered in dust and mouse droppings, but the walls were solid. The floor didn't sag. The windows, though filthy, were unbroken. "It's like a castle that needs cleaning," Mara said, forcing brightness into her voice. "We can do that, right?" Zoe looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "Where will I go to school? There's a town, Tillamook. We passed it on the way. You'll go to school there. What about my friends? You'll make new friends." But Zoe was crying now, and Mara pulled her close, pressing her face into her daughter's hair, breathing in the strawberry scent of the cheap shampoo they could barely afford. "I know this is scary. I know it's not what we wanted. But we're together, and we're safe, and we're going to make this work. I promise." The promise tasted like ash in her mouth. That first night they slept in their clothes on a mattress they'd pulled from one of the bedrooms and dragged outside to air out. Mara lay awake listening to the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness, to the crash of waves against the rocks a quarter-mile away, to Zoe's quiet sobs that eventually faded into exhausted sleep. She checked her phone. No signal. They were too remote, too isolated, cut off from everything. Mara closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she'd felt hope. It had been so long ago that the memory felt like fiction. Morning came gray and cold. Mara woke to find Zoe already up, standing at the broken window, staring out at the rows of tanks. "Mommy, those tanks are leaking." Mara joined her. In daylight, the devastation was even more apparent. Every tank had cracks, some small, some gaping wounds in the concrete. Black water seeped out, creating rivers that carved paths through the property toward the distant ocean. "Yeah, baby. That's why this place is worth almost nothing." What was in them? Fish, I think, Uncle Thomas raised fish.
If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this.
But they're all dead now? Yeah, they're all dead now. They spent the morning exploring, cataloging the disaster. 30 tanks, all cracked and leaking, processing equipment that had corroded into uselessness, a generator that wouldn't start, solar panels that had been shattered by storms, an electrical system that looked like it predated the moon landing. Mara found Uncle Thomas's office in the main building. The desk was covered in papers, yellowed and water-stained, showing financial records from 2009, the year he'd apparently abandoned everything. She flipped through them, her bookkeeper's brain automatically processing the numbers. Uncle Thomas had been successful once. Revenue of $400,000 a year selling salmon and steelhead to restaurants and specialty markets. But expenses had been high, repairs constant, and then something had happened. A letter from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, dated March 2009. Notice of violation. Your aquaculture operation has been found to be discharging pollutants into coastal waters. Cease operations immediately. Failure to comply will result in fines of $1,000 per day. Another letter from a lawyer. Class action lawsuit filed by neighboring property owners. Claims of property damage due to toxic runoff. Estimated liability $2.3 million. And finally, a handwritten note in Uncle Thomas's shaky script. I can't fix this. I tried. God knows I tried. But sometimes the damage is too deep, the cost too high. Maybe someone stronger will find a way. I'm sorry. The note was dated April 15th, 2009, the day he'd walked away from everything. Mara felt tears prick her eyes. She understood that feeling, that moment when the weight becomes too much and walking away seems like the only option. But she couldn't walk away. She had nowhere to go. Over the next 3 days, Mara and Zoe worked to make the living quarters habitable. They cleaned obsessively, scrubbing mold and mouse droppings and 15 years of neglect. They drove to Tillamook for supplies, spending $200 they couldn't afford on cleaning products, sheets, towels, and food. Mara registered Zoe for school, lying on the forms about their address, claiming they lived in town rather than on a condemned property. The school secretary looked at her with suspicion but didn't push. On the 4th day, a truck appeared at the broken gate. A man in his 60s climbed out, wearing rubber boots and a rain jacket. He approached cautiously, like someone expecting to be chased off. You the new owner? His voice was rough but not unkind. Mara, wiping her hands on jeans that were already ruined. Yes, Mara Chen, Dan Kowalski. I've got the oyster farm next door. He gestured vaguely south. Been watching this place rot for 15 years. Was hoping whoever inherited it would have sense enough to bulldoze it. That's the plan, Mara lied. Eventually. Dan's expression said he didn't believe her. Look, I'll be straight with you. That runoff from your tanks has been poisoning my beds for over a decade. I've lost probably $100,000 in oyster production. I've got every right to sue you into oblivion. Mara's stomach dropped. I don't have anything to sue for. I know. That's why I'm here instead of my lawyer. Dan pulled off his baseball cap, ran a hand through gray hair. Your Uncle Thomas, he was a good man. Got in over his head with the expansion, but he wasn't malicious. I figure you're in the same boat, so here's my offer. You drain those tanks properly, stop the leaking, and I'll forget about the damages. Deal? I don't know how to drain them. I don't even know where to start. Dan studied her for a long moment. You really inherited this mess without knowing what you were getting into? I inherited this mess because I had nowhere else to go. Something shifted in Dan's expression. Pity, maybe, or recognition. He'd probably seen desperation before in coastal communities where fishing families struggled and aquaculture promised salvation but delivered bankruptcy. I'll help you, he said finally. I've got equipment, and I know the systems Thomas used, but I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't give up. Not yet. There might be something here worth saving. Mara looked at the rows of cracked tanks, the collapsing buildings, the property that represented nothing but debt and disaster. What could possibly be worth saving? Dan smiled slightly. That's what we're going to find out. Over the next week, Dan became Mara's lifeline. He brought pumps and hoses, showed her how to drain the tanks safely without creating even more environmental damage. They worked in rain and cold, Mara in borrowed gear too big for her frame, learning about pH levels and bacteria and the delicate ecosystem of aquaculture. Zoe helped when she wasn't at school, carrying tools and asking questions. Dan was patient with her, explaining things in ways an 8-year-old could understand. As they drained each tank, the damage became more apparent. Not just cracks, but systematic failure. The concrete had degraded, minerals leaching out, leaving structures that were more suggestion than solid. "This is worse than I thought," Dan said on the 8th day, standing in tank number 14. "The whole thing needs to be demolished and rebuilt. That's $30,000 per tank, easy. You're looking at $1 million just to get back to functional." Mara's hands were raw despite gloves. Her back ached, and she was pretty sure she'd lost 5 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. "I don't have $1 million. I barely have 1,000. Then you sell. The land alone is worth maybe 200,000 if you can find the right buyer. Take that money and start over somewhere else." But even as he said it, Mara knew it was impossible. Selling property with 37,000 in fines and potential environmental liability? Who would buy that? And even if someone did, by the time lawyers got involved, she'd be lucky to walk away with $50,000. Enough to rent an apartment for maybe a year before the money ran out and she was right back where she started. There has to be another way. Dan looked at her with something like sadness. Sometimes there isn't. On the 10th day, while draining tank number 19, Mara noticed something odd. The tank's drain valve was different from the others, heavier, more industrial, with a secondary pipe running not to the main drainage system but somewhere else. "Dan, look at this." He examined it, frowning. "That's weird. This pipe goes under the foundation. Where's it draining to?" They followed the pipe as best they could, tracing its path through the mud. It ran beneath tank 20, beneath 21, and then disappeared under the main building itself. "There must be a containment system," Dan said. Thomas was paranoid about spills. Maybe he built a holding tank under the building. They searched the main building for access, finding it finally in what had been the processing room. A hatch in the floor covered by a sheet of plywood and years of accumulated debris. Mara pulled the plywood aside. Below was a ladder descending into darkness. "I'll go," Dan said, but Mara was already climbing down. The space below was massive, a basement she hadn't known existed. Her phone's flashlight revealed concrete walls, a low ceiling maybe 7 feet high, and rows of what looked like massive steel tubes, each one 20 feet long and 4 feet in diameter, sealed with industrial bolts. "What are these?" Her voice echoed in the enclosed space. Dan had followed her down. He approached the nearest tube, examining it. Pressure vessels, commercial grade. Thomas never mentioned anything like this. There were 12 tubes total, arranged in 2 rows of 6. Each had a small viewing window, fogged with condensation. Mara wiped one clean and peered inside. The tube was filled with water, crystal clear despite being sealed for possibly 15 years. And swimming in that water were fish, dozens of them, each one maybe 6 inches long, scales glittering even in the dim light. "They're alive." Mara's voice was barely a whisper. "Dan, there are fish alive down here. That's impossible. They'd need food, fresh water, proper oxygen levels. They can't have survived 15 years. But they had. Somehow, impossibly, they had." Dan examined the tube systems. "This is incredible. The tubes have their own life support, powered by," he traced cables running along the ceiling, "solar panels. Even after 15 years, the system's still functioning." Thomas must have designed this as a breeding vault, completely isolated from the main operation. Breeding what? Dan cleaned another viewing window, peered inside. His expression changed, shock replacing confusion. Mara, these aren't regular salmon. These are white sturgeon. And unless I'm wrong, they're pure, genetically perfect specimens. Mara stared at the fish. They looked ordinary to her, just fish swimming in circles. Why does that matter? Because white sturgeon are nearly extinct in the wild. Because breeding programs have been trying for decades to maintain genetic diversity. Because a single breeding quality female can be worth $50,000 to the right research institution. Dan's voice was rising with excitement. And you've got what, maybe 500 fish down here? If even 10% are breeding quality, that's 2.5 million. The number was so large it felt fictional. Mara sank to the cold concrete floor, her legs giving out. That's not possible. It's not just possible. It's right in front of us. Dan was moving from tube to tube, checking each one. But here's the thing. We need to verify species, check genetic markers, make sure these really are pure stock. That requires equipment we don't have and expertise neither of us possess. Can we sell them as is? Not legally. White sturgeon are protected. Every transaction requires federal permits, genetic certification, proof of breeding origin. But if we can prove these are Thomas's fish, if we can show they've been maintained in a registered breeding program, Dan stopped, thinking. We need to find Thomas's records, everything he filed with Fish and Wildlife. If he registered this vault, if he got the proper permits back in 2009 or earlier, then these fish are legal to sell. And if he didn't, then you're in possession of an endangered species without permits. That's a federal crime. Mara felt hope draining away as quickly as it had arrived. Of course there would be complications. Nothing in her life was ever simple. They searched for 2 days, tearing apart Uncle Thomas's office, looking for anything related to the breeding vault. Mara found financial records, equipment manifests, correspondence with suppliers, but nothing about the tubes or the fish. On the 3rd day, Zoe found it. She'd been exploring, which Mara had told her not to do, but which she did anyway because she was 8 and bored, and this place was full of mysteries. She'd discovered a second office hidden behind a false wall in the maintenance shed. Mommy, there's a room here with papers. Mara's heart leaped. Inside the hidden office, everything was preserved perfectly. Dry, organized, meticulously documented, Uncle Thomas's true records. She found the breeding program documentation immediately. White Sturgeon Conservation Breeding Initiative, registered with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in 2003. Federal permit issued, renewable annually, paid through 2025. Uncle Thomas had prepaid 16 years of permit fees before he disappeared. There were genetic records for every fish, breeding lineages traced back 3 generations, health certifications from marine biologists, letters from research institutions offering to purchase specific specimens, and there, in a folder labeled Valuation, was an independent appraisal from 2008. Total program value, $343 million based on genetic diversity, breeding potential, and conservation importance. $343 million. Mara read the number 5 times. Read the justification. Read the biologist's notes about genetic markers and breeding ratios and conservation imperatives. She called Dan. He drove over immediately, bringing a friend named Sarah who worked for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Sarah spent 3 hours examining the tubes, testing water samples, photographing fish, checking Uncle Thomas's documentation. Finally, she surfaced, her expression awed. This is legitimate. These are registered breeding stock, legally maintained, with complete genetic records. She paused. This might be the most important sturgeon breeding population outside of federal programs. Universities will pay millions for access. Conservation groups will pay millions more. And collectors, Sarah's voice dropped. Collectors will pay anything for legal breeding pairs. How much? Mara's voice shook. The appraisal says $343 million. I'd say that's conservative. With 15 years of inflation and increased scarcity, you're probably looking at 400 million, maybe more. The number was so large it lost meaning. Mara felt her knees buckle. Dan caught her, guided her to a chair. Breathe, you're okay, just breathe. I don't understand. If this was worth so much, why did Uncle Thomas abandon it? Sarah had been reading through the 2009 correspondence. It looks like he panicked. The DEU violations, the lawsuit, the main operation failing. He probably thought everything was lost and didn't realize the breeding vault could be maintained independently. Or maybe, Sarah looked at Mara, maybe he was preserving it for whoever came next. These prepaid permits, the sealed vault. It's almost like he knew someone would eventually find it and need it. Mara thought about Uncle Thomas's note. Maybe someone stronger will find a way. He hadn't been apologizing for giving up. He'd been leaving a message. What do I do now? The question came out small and frightened. Sarah smiled. Now you become very, very rich, and you save a species in the process. The next 6 months passed in a blur of documentation, verification, and negotiation. Sarah connected Mara with a lawyer who specialized in environmental permits and conservation programs. Together, they contacted universities, research institutions, and federal conservation programs. The interest was immediate and intense. Oregon State University offered $50 million for perpetual breeding access to 100 specimens. The National Marine Fisheries Service offered $75 million for 200 fish to establish a new breeding program in California. Private collectors offered astronomical sums for individual breeding pairs. But Mara made a different choice. She established the Thomas Chen Conservation Foundation, transferring the breeding vault into a non-profit trust. The foundation would maintain the breeding program, supplying fish to conservation efforts worldwide while generating sustainable income through partnerships with research institutions. The initial capitalization deals brought in $180 million. Half would fund the foundation's operations in perpetuity. The other half, after taxes, was Mara's. She paid off the county fines, paid Dan for his help, writing him a check for $500,000 that made the old oyster farmer cry, hired contractors to properly cap and remove the leaking tanks, restoring the property to environmental compliance. And then she rebuilt. The main building became a state-of-the-art conservation research facility, employing 30 local people. The processing rooms transformed into laboratories. The office space became classrooms, where marine biology students could learn about sturgeon conservation. The property's 47 acres became a marine education center, with walking trails and interpretive exhibits explaining coastal ecosystems and the importance of species preservation. Mara kept the small living quarters, though she could afford a mansion now. She and Zoe lived there, walking distance from the facility, part of the daily rhythm of conservation and research. 1 year after that first desperate arrival, Mara stood on the restored property, watching school groups tour the facility. Children pressed their faces against viewing windows, staring at fish that represented hope, survival, the refusal to accept extinction. Dan approached carrying 2 cups of coffee, quite a transformation. Mara accepted the coffee, warm against her cold hands. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. That we went from $400 and nowhere to go to, she gestured at the facility. This. You earned it. You fought when most people would have given up. I almost did give up. That first night, lying in that filthy room, I wanted to. Zoe was crying and I was crying, and it felt like the world had finally broken me completely. But you didn't let it. That's what matters. They watched the children for a while, their excitement palpable even from a distance. You know what the best part is? Mara said softly. It's not the money. It's not even the conservation work, though that's important. It's showing Zoe that being broken isn't the end. That sometimes disaster is just transformation in disguise. That her mother took the worst situation possible and turned it into something that matters. Dan smiled. Thomas would be proud. He built this vault hoping someone would find it, someone who needed it. He built it for you. Mara thought about that. Uncle Thomas, broken by failure, walking away from everything but leaving behind a seed of hope. A breeding vault that preserved life, that waited 15 years for someone desperate enough to look beyond the obvious disaster to the hidden treasure. He built it for anyone who refused to quit. That evening, after the tours ended and the staff went home, Mara descended into the breeding vault with Zoe. The tubes hummed softly, life support systems working perfectly, maintaining the fish that had survived impossible odds. "Mommy, are we rich now?" Zoe pressed her face against a viewing window. "Yeah, baby, we're rich now. What are we going to do with all that money?" Mara had thought about this question constantly. The money in the bank, more than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. The responsibility that came with it. The opportunity. We're going to help people like us. Single parents who are one crisis away from disaster. We're going to build housing and fund education and create opportunities. We're going to make sure no one else has to feel like I felt that night in the parking lot, watching you play and knowing I couldn't keep you safe. Zoe was quiet for a moment. Uncle Thomas was smart. Why do you say that? Because he hid something valuable where only someone desperate would look. Someone who needed it enough to come all the way out here to a scary, broken farm. Someone like us. Mara pulled her daughter close. You're right. He was very smart. As they climbed back up the ladder, Mara looked back at the tubes one more time. 12 pressure vessels containing 600 fish that refused to die, that survived 15 years of neglect because Uncle Thomas had built systems resilient enough to outlast his own despair. She thought about the $343 million, about the foundation that would fund conservation for generations, about the research facility that would employ hundreds over the decades, about the education programs that would inspire thousands of children to care about preservation and ecology. But mostly she thought about that first day, standing in front of the leaking tanks, convinced she'd inherited nothing but disaster, about how wrong she'd been, about how the worst inheritance imaginable had transformed into the greatest gift. 6 months later, Mara stood at a podium in Portland, accepting the Governor's Environmental Excellence Award on behalf of the Mara Chen Conservation Foundation. The ballroom was packed with scientists, politicians, and conservationists, all applauding the work being done to save white sturgeon from extinction. Zoe sat in the front row, wearing a new dress and a smile that lit up the room. Beside her sat Dan and Sarah, the friends who'd made everything possible. Mara had prepared remarks, professional, polished words about conservation and legacy and the importance of environmental stewardship. But when she looked at Zoe, at that beautiful girl who'd been through so much, the prepared speech evaporated. I was broke when I inherited my uncle's farm, not just financially broke, but broken in spirit, broken by a world that seemed designed to crush single mothers, to punish women for making mistakes, to ensure that poverty was permanent. The room went quiet. This wasn't the speech they'd expected. I arrived at that property with Mom 400, a daughter who depended on me, and no options left. The farm was condemned. The tanks were leaking. The county wanted $37,000 in fines. Every rational person told me to walk away. And I almost did. Mara's voice caught, but my daughter needed me to be stronger than despair. So I stayed. I worked. I learned. And beneath the disaster, hidden where only someone desperate enough would look, I found something worth saving. She paused, composing herself. Uncle Thomas built that breeding vault knowing he'd failed, knowing he was walking away from everything, but he left it there, maintained and preserved, for whoever came next, for whoever needed it. And what I've learned over this past year is that's what we all have to do: build something that outlasts our failures, create systems that survive our despair, leave behind seeds of hope for people we'll never meet, but who will need them desperately. The applause started slowly, then built into something powerful. People stood. Mara saw tears on faces throughout the room. Scientists who understood the technical achievement, politicians who understood the human story, parents who understood the desperation. After the ceremony, a young woman approached. She was maybe 25, holding a baby, her eyes red from crying. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaking, "but I had to tell you that your story, what you said about being broke and broken, that's me right now. I'm 3 weeks from eviction. I have no family. I don't know what to do." Mara took her hands. "What's your name?" "Christina." "Christina, where are you living?" "Salem. I work at a gas station, but it's not enough. I can't afford daycare and rent and food. I can't make the math work." Mara pulled out her phone, typed a message. "My assistant is going to call you tomorrow. The foundation has an emergency housing program for single parents in crisis. We'll get you set up with an apartment, help with childcare, job training if you want it. You're going to be okay." Christina was crying now. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because someone gave me a chance when I had nothing. Now I'm passing it forward." After Christina left, Dan appeared beside Mara. "You didn't mention that housing program in your speech. That's because I just decided to start it. We've got $90 million in the foundation that's not allocated yet. Why not use some of it to help people like Christina, like I was?" Dan smiled. Thomas really did choose the right person to inherit his vault. Mara looked around the ballroom. All these successful people, these scientists and politicians and conservationists, they were celebrating what she'd accomplished. But the person she'd really helped tonight was Christina. And tomorrow there would be another Christina, and another. Each one desperate, each one broken, each one needing someone to say, "You're worth saving." That became Mara's mission. The conservation work continued, managed by experts she'd hired. But Mara herself focused on the housing program, expanding it from Oregon to Washington to California. Within 2 years, the Mara Chen Emergency Housing Initiative had helped 300 families avoid homelessness. She bought apartment buildings and converted them into transitional housing, hired caseworkers to help families navigate benefits and job training, created childcare co-ops so parents could work without worry, built support networks so no one had to face crisis alone. And every person she helped, she told them the same thing. "This isn't charity. This is me passing forward a gift I received when I needed it most. When you're back on your feet, you pass it forward too." That's how we break the cycle of desperation. 3 years after inheriting the farm, Mara received a letter. No return address, just a Portland postmark. Inside was a short note and a photograph. "Dear Mara," the note read, "I was Christina, the woman with the baby who approached you after the governor's awards. Your housing program saved my life. I'm writing to say thank you and to show you what your kindness made possible." The photograph showed Christina in nursing scrubs, standing outside a hospital, holding her now 3-year-old daughter, both of them smiling. "I graduated nursing school last month," the note continued. "I got a job at Oregon Health Sciences University. My daughter is in a good daycare. We have our own apartment that I can afford. We're going to be okay because you believed we were worth saving, and I'm passing it forward. I volunteer at the transitional housing where you placed us, helping new families navigate the process, sharing my story so they know there's hope, because that's what you taught me, that being broken isn't permanent. That one act of kindness can change everything. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. Thank you for choosing to help instead of just feeling sorry. Thank you for showing me that people like us matter. With gratitude, Christina." Mara read the letter 3 times, then pinned it to the wall in her office. Over the months that followed, more letters arrived. From families who'd stayed in the transitional housing, from parents who'd received job training, from children who'd had stable homes because someone decided they were worth saving. Each letter went on the wall. By the end of the 3rd year, the entire wall was covered. Hundreds of stories, thousands of lives changed, all because Mara had refused to see disaster as the end. One evening, Zoe, now 11 years old, stood in the office studying the letters. "Mom, do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't come here, if you'd refused the inheritance all the time?" Mara joined her daughter. "We'd probably still be struggling, still one crisis away from disaster. I'd still be working 3 jobs and you'd still be watching me break down piece by piece. But Uncle Thomas's farm saved us. Uncle Thomas's vault saved us. The farm was just disaster hiding opportunity. And that's the lesson I try to remember when things get hard, that sometimes the worst situation possible is actually the doorway to something better. You just have to be brave enough to walk through it." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "I'm proud of you, Mom, not because you're rich now, because you use it to help people who need it." Mara pulled her daughter close. "That's the only thing wealth is good for, baby, making sure people aren't as scared and desperate as we were." They stood together in the office, surrounded by letters from strangers who'd become family. Lives transformed by one woman's refusal to give up, by one uncle's decision to hide treasure where only the desperate would find it, by the understanding that the greatest inheritance isn't money, but the belief that people deserve second chances. 5 years after that first desperate arrival, Mara stood on the property watching construction crews build the new education center. The old processing building had been demolished, replaced with a modern facility designed for thousands of student visits per year. The breeding vault remained unchanged, hidden beneath the research center, still producing fish that were saving the species from extinction, still generating income that funded conservation worldwide. But the property itself had been transformed. Where toxic tanks once leaked, native plants now grew in carefully restored wetlands. Where collapsed buildings had stood, walking paths wound through ecosystems designed to educate and inspire. Sarah approached, carrying her ever-present clipboard. The university confirmed their commitment. They'll send 200 graduate students per year for hands-on sturgeon research. That's another $5 million in program fees. Mara nodded. "Make sure 20% goes to local schools. Free field trips, free programs, free everything. No child should miss out because their family can't afford it." "You know," Sarah said softly, "most people who inherited what you inherited would have just sold it, taken the money and disappeared, built themselves a mansion, retired to some island." I thought about it. For maybe 5 minutes I thought about it, but then I remembered Christina and all the other people like her, like me, and I realized that the only way to honor Uncle Thomas's gift was to pass it forward. He'd be proud. Mara wasn't sure about that. She'd never known Uncle Thomas, had only the barest memories of a quiet man who'd shown up to one family gathering when she was young and then disappeared into his coastal exile. But she'd read his journals, found them in the hidden office, years of careful documentation. He'd written about the breeding program, about his hopes for sturgeon conservation, but he'd also written about failure, about the crushing weight of debt and lawsuit and environmental violations. The final entry, dated the day before he'd walked away, had been short. "I've failed at everything except one thing. The vault, the fish, the future. Someone will find them someday, someone who needs them. I hope they're brave enough to see past the disaster to the opportunity. I hope they use it wisely. I hope they understand that the greatest legacy isn't what we build, but who we save." Mara had understood. She'd lived that understanding every day for 5 years. Dan arrived, parking his truck in the visitor lot. He was 67 now, officially retired, though he still consulted for the foundation and spent most days at the facility. "Got the final numbers on this year's breeding program," he said, handing Mara a folder. 214 juveniles ready for release. That's 3 more than last year. The population's stabilizing. Mara reviewed the numbers. Each juvenile represented thousands of hours of care, millions of dollars in research, the dedication of dozens of scientists and technicians. But more than that, each fish represented hope, proof that extinction could be reversed, that care and commitment mattered. "How's the oyster farm?" she asked. "Good, better than good. With your runoff cleaned up and the ecosystem restored, I'm producing twice what I did before." He smiled. "Which means I can finally afford to retire for real. Let my son run things. You're not thinking of leaving?" "Never. This place is my life." Dan gestured at the property. "What you've built here, what Thomas started and you finished, it's important. I want to be part of it as long as I can." They walked together toward the wetlands, following paths that hadn't existed 5 years ago. Students worked in groups, taking water samples, identifying plant species, learning about ecosystem restoration. "You know what Thomas told me once?" Dan said. This was years ago, back when he was still running the salmon operation. He said the hardest part of aquaculture wasn't the fish. It was accepting that failure was part of the process, that you'd lose batches, that disease would wipe out tanks, that storms would destroy equipment. He said the only way to survive was to build systems that could outlast your worst day. Mara thought about the breeding vault, built beneath the main operation, isolated and protected, designed to survive even if everything else failed. Uncle Thomas had understood something profound, that success required preparation for failure, that hope required acknowledging despair, that salvation required systems designed to endure. "That's what I'm trying to do with the housing program," she said. "Build systems that outlast crisis. Give people tools that work even on their worst day. You're doing it." Dan's voice was firm. "Every family you help, every person who doesn't end up on the street, that's Thomas's legacy living on. That's all our legacy," Mara corrected. "Yours for teaching me, Sarah's for verifying the fish, the town's for accepting us. It's everyone who chose to help instead of judging." They reached the viewing platform overlooking the wetlands. Below, a great blue heron stalked through shallow water, hunting. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean rolled against rocky shores, eternal and indifferent. Mara thought about that first night, the terror, the certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake, the feeling that the world had finally broken her completely. She'd been wrong. The world hadn't broken her. It had tested her, and beneath the test, hidden where only the desperate would look, had been salvation. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, 7 years after Mara had first arrived at the property. She was in her office reviewing grant applications for the housing program when her assistant knocked. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. He won't give his name, but he claims to be family." Mara's stomach tightened. She hadn't spoken to anyone from her father's side of the family since Uncle Thomas's funeral. Her father had died when she was 12, and his relatives had made it clear at the time that they wanted nothing to do with her mother or her. "Send him in." The man who entered was in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the casual coastal setting. He had her father's eyes, the same dark brown, the same wary intensity. "I'm David Chen. Thomas was my father, which makes me your cousin." Mara felt the room tilt slightly. "Uncle Thomas had a son? I didn't know he had children." David sat without being invited, his posture rigid. "He didn't, not officially. My mother and Thomas were never married. He supported us financially but kept his distance. Said he couldn't be a proper father, that his work was too consuming." He gestured around the office. Apparently he was right about the consuming part. "Why are you here, David?" "Because my mother died 3 months ago, and in going through her papers I found letters from Thomas, dozens of them spanning 40 years. He pulled a folder from his briefcase. In one of them, dated 2008, he mentioned the breeding vault, said if anything happened to him, someone needed to know the full story." Mara's pulse quickened. What full story? David opened the folder. The sturgeon weren't just a conservation project. They were insurance. Thomas discovered something in the late 1990s, something that made him realize the salmon operation couldn't last. Disease in the wild stocks, pollution in the coastal waters, climate change affecting spawning cycles. He knew aquaculture was heading for collapse. So he built the vault. Not just built it. He filled it with the most genetically valuable sturgeon he could find, then sealed it away and waited for the inevitable. David's expression was bitter. My father was a genius at systems. He could look at a failing ecosystem and predict the exact year it would collapse. But he couldn't look at his own son and figure out how to be present. Mara heard the pain beneath the anger. I'm sorry he wasn't there for you. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you got everything. The property, the vault, the fortune, the legacy. I got child support checks and a father who visited twice a year if I was lucky. The words landed like accusations, and Mara felt her defenses rising. I didn't ask for any of this. I was broke and desperate and homeless. Thomas left me this because I had nowhere else to go. He left you this because you were desperate enough to look past the disaster. David's voice softened slightly. That's what he wrote in the letter. He said he needed someone who'd appreciate salvation, not someone who expected inheritance. He knew I'd just sell it all and waste the money, but you'd fight for it. The silence between them stretched. Outside, Mara could hear students laughing as they headed to the wetlands for field research. Normal sounds of a place that had become extraordinary. What do you want, David? I want to understand why a man who could plan 30 years into the future couldn't plan how to be a father. I want to know if he ever felt guilty for abandoning me. But since I can't ask him, David met her eyes. I wanted to meet the person he chose over his own blood. He didn't choose me over you. He barely knew me. This was about need, not preference. Maybe, or maybe he saw in you what he wished he'd been, someone who could turn disaster into purpose. David stood. I'm not here to take anything from you. I signed away any claim years ago when I accepted his final payment. I just wanted to see what was worth more than his own child. Mara stood too. David, I can't change what Thomas did or didn't do, but I can tell you that every day I work to honor what he built. Not the money, the intention behind it. He created systems that save people. That matters. Does it matter enough to make up for abandoning your family? No, nothing makes up for that, but it matters anyway. David looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. My mother said Thomas was complicated, that he felt things deeply but couldn't express them, that his way of loving was building things that outlasted him. She paused. I think she was trying to help me forgive him. Have you? Some days. David moved toward the door, then stopped. The letters mentioned something else. A second vault. Smaller, personal. He said it was hidden in the original house where he lived before building the main facility. Said it contained things that mattered more than money. Mara felt her breath catch. There's an original house? Half-mile north of here, abandoned long before the main operation. Thomas lived there in the 1970s when he first bought the property. David pulled out a folded map. This shows the location. If you find anything that explains why he was the way he was, I'd like to know. After David left, Mara studied the map. She'd explored most of the 47 acres over the years, but had never ventured into the heavily forested area to the north. According to David's map, the house sat on a bluff overlooking the ocean, accessible only by an overgrown trail. She found Dan in the research center, examining juvenile sturgeon. I need your help with something. They hiked north, following what might have once been a path, but was now barely visible beneath blackberry vines and salal. The forest here was old growth, massive Sitka spruce and Douglas fir creating a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. After 20 minutes, they emerged onto a bluff. Below, the Pacific stretched to the horizon, and there, perched on the edge of the cliff, was a small cabin. maybe 800 square feet, shingled in weathered cedar, its windows intact but clouded with salt and age. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was frozen in time. Furniture from the 1970s, harvest gold and avocado green, books lining makeshift shelves, a small kitchen with dishes still in the sink, as if Thomas had simply walked away mid-meal. This is where he lived before. Everything. Mara's voice was quiet. Before the success, before the expansion, before it all fell apart. Dan was examining photographs on the wall. A younger Thomas, maybe 30, standing with a woman and a small boy. David and his mother. More photos showed Thomas working on early fish tanks, crude concrete structures that looked nothing like the sophisticated operation he'd eventually build. Mara searched the cabin methodically. She found journals in a closet documenting Thomas's early attempts at aquaculture, his excitement about the possibilities, his hope that this could be different from commercial fishing, sustainable and responsible. But she also found entries about his struggles, about David's mother wanting him to give up the fish farming dream and get a normal job, about Thomas unable to imagine a life that didn't involve building something important, about the slow fracture of their relationship as his obsession grew. "I chose the fish over my family," one entry read. "I told myself it was for their future, that if I built something successful I could give them everything. But the truth was simpler and worse. I chose the fish because I understood them, because their needs were clear and solvable, because loving them didn't require the vulnerability that loving people did." Mara felt tears prick her eyes. He knew what he was doing. He knew he was failing them, and he did it anyway. Dan had found a lockbox under the bed. It wasn't locked, just latched. Inside were more letters, these addressed to David but never sent. Dozens of them, spanning years. Mara read one at random, dated 1985. "David, you're 10 years old now, and I've missed most of it. Your mother sends photos, and I study them like research data, trying to understand how you've grown, what you're interested in, who you're becoming. But photos aren't the same as presents. I know that. I've always known that. I tell myself that I'm building something for your future, that someday you'll inherit an operation worth millions, and you'll understand why I had to focus so completely. But I'm lying to myself. The truth is, I'm building this because I'm afraid of failing at the one thing that matters most, being your father. Fish don't judge. They don't need emotional availability. They just need the right environment, and they thrive. I can provide that. I'm good at that. But you need more than environment. You need a father who shows up, who knows your teachers' names, who attends your soccer games, and I can't be that person, not because the work prevents it, but because I'm too afraid of doing it wrong. So I do nothing, and in doing nothing, I fail you more completely than if I'd tried and gotten it wrong. I'm sorry. I know this apology means nothing when it's written but never sent. I know you'll grow up resenting me, maybe hating me, and you'll be right to. But I want you to know that my absence wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was about my cowardice, my inability to be vulnerable, my choice to hide behind work instead of showing up for the hard stuff. The fish will survive me. They're designed to. But this relationship, this chance to be your father, it won't survive my neglect. And someday when it's too late to fix, I'll understand that I built an empire but lost a son, and the empire won't matter." Mara closed the letter carefully. She understood now why Thomas had left everything to her instead of David, not because she deserved it more, but because David deserved something money couldn't buy. An explanation, an acknowledgement, the truth his father had been too afraid to speak while alive. "We need to show these to David." Dan nodded. "Every single one. He deserves to know his father saw the truth, even if he couldn't act on it." They found something else in the lockbox, a small key with a tag labeled "For whoever finds this place." The key fit a padlock on a storm cellar door outside the cabin. Below was a small space, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a single shelf. On that shelf sat a metal box. Inside were documents, but not financial ones. These were personal. Letters from David's mother describing their son's achievements. Elementary school report cards, all A's. Middle school science fair awards. High school graduation announcement. College acceptance letter to Stanford. Thomas had kept everything. Every piece of evidence that David was thriving despite his father's absence. Or maybe because of it. And at the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope addressed to Mara. She opened it with trembling hands. "If you're reading this," Thomas had written, "then you found the cabin and the letters, and you're trying to understand why I was the way I was. The answer isn't complicated. I was a coward. I built systems that solved problems I understood because I was terrified of problems I didn't. I chose fish over family because fish were safe, predictable, manageable. But in choosing safety, I lost everything that mattered. David grew up without a father. His mother struggled alone. And I built an empire of isolation. The breeding vault was my attempt at redemption. Not for David, it was too late for that, but for someone else. Someone who'd need salvation the way I'd needed it when I was young and desperate and trying to prove I could build something meaningful. I made the vault impossible to find unless you were willing to look past obvious disaster. Because that's what life is, isn't it? Disaster hiding opportunity, failure concealing seeds of success, and only the desperate look hard enough to find them. You found them, Mara, which means you were desperate, which means you needed this. And I hope it saved you the way I wish someone had saved me. But here's what I really want you to understand. Don't do what I did. Don't choose systems over people. Don't hide behind work because vulnerability is frightening. The vault will generate money for generations. Use it to help people, yes, but don't let it become a shield against human connection. Love your daughter. Show up for her. Be present in ways I never was for David. Let her see you fail sometimes. Let her know you're human, because perfect fathers build empires, but human fathers build relationships, and relationships matter more. Tell David I'm sorry. Tell him I knew what I was doing wrong and did it anyway. Tell him his mother was right about me being complicated. Tell him Mara paused, reading the final lines. Tell him that his success, his happiness, his ability to live fully despite my absence, that's the only legacy that actually matters. Not the money, not the conservation work. Him, living well. That's my only real success. With regret and hope, Thomas. Mara read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. She and Dan packed everything. The letters, the photos, David's childhood records, all of it. Evidence of a man who saw his failures clearly, but couldn't change them. Back at the facility, Mara called David. He arrived the next morning, his expression guarded. "I found the cabin, and I found these." She handed him the box. David opened it slowly, then stared at the contents. "These are," his voice cracked, "these are my report cards, my awards." He kept them, all of them, every single one. Mara handed him the letter Thomas had written to her. He also wrote this. "I think you should read it alone." David took the letter and walked out to the wetlands viewing platform. Mara watched through the window as he read, his shoulders shaking. He stayed there for an hour, the letter clutched in his hands, staring at the water. When he came back, his eyes were red, but his expression had changed. Something had softened. He knew, David said simply. He knew exactly what he was doing wrong, and he couldn't stop himself. Some people are like that. They see the cliff and walk toward it anyway. David sat heavily in a chair. I spent 30 years being angry at him. 30 years steering me or thinking he just didn't care, but this, he held up the letter, this is worse somehow. He cared. He just couldn't translate caring into action. Mara sat across from him. I can't fix what Thomas did or didn't do, but I can tell you that the vault, everything he built, it's helping people, hundreds of families. And if you want to be part of that, if you want to turn his legacy into something that matters to you, There's space for that. David looked at her, surprised. What do you mean? I mean, you're his son. You have a right to be part of this foundation. Not as an inheritor, you already refused that, but as a partner, as someone who understands that building systems matters, but only if those systems serve people. Why would you offer me that? Because Thomas was right about one thing. Relationships matter more than empires. And you and I, we're family. Broken, complicated, connected by a man who couldn't figure out how to love properly, but family nonetheless. David was quiet for a long moment. What would I do? Whatever you want. Mara smiled slightly. We need someone to develop programs for children of single parents, kids who are growing up watching their mothers or fathers struggle, who need mentorship and support and proof that they're not defined by their circumstances. That's specific. That's Zoe. That's David, the boy who grew up with an absent father. That's everyone who needs to know they matter, despite the people who should have loved them better. David's expression shifted. He paused. I work in tech. Software development. I make good money. I don't need a job. This isn't about money. This is about building something that would have helped you when you were young. Something that gives children what Thomas couldn't give you. Presence, attention, the message that they're worth showing up for. She saw the moment he understood, the moment anger transmuted into purpose. I'll need to think about it. Take all the time you need. But David was already thinking. She could see it. His mind working through possibilities, designing systems that could translate his pain into help for others. Exactly like his father, but pointed in a direction Thomas had never managed. 3 months later, David moved to Tillamook. He bought a small house in town and began developing the Children's Resilience Program, funded by the foundation but designed entirely by him. It focused on kids ages 8 to 18, providing mentorship, therapy access, educational support, and most importantly, consistent adult presence. The program launched with 20 children. Within a year, it had expanded to serve 200 across 3 counties. David hired therapists and teachers and mentors, all people who understood that children needed more than money. They needed someone to show up, to remember their names, to care about their struggles. Mara watched him transform. The bitter, angry man who'd shown up in her office became someone purposeful, driven, healing himself by healing others. One evening they sat together on the viewing platform, watching sunset paint the wetlands gold and orange. I used to fantasize about my father dying, David said quietly. About getting a phone call saying he was gone and feeling nothing, feeling vindicated that I'd mattered so little. And when it actually happened, I felt empty. Not vindicated, not relieved, just empty. Like there'd been this question my whole life, will he ever show up? And the answer was finally definitively no. Mara thought about her own father, dead when she was 12. About the questions that could never be answered, the conversations that would never happen. I'm sorry you didn't get closure, but I did. David turned to her. Those letters, the ones he never sent, they gave me something better than closure. They gave me understanding. He wasn't a villain. He was just broken in ways he couldn't fix. And knowing that, seeing his awareness of his own failures, somehow that matters. Does it make you forgive him? Some days. David smiled slightly. Other days I'm still angry, but mostly I'm grateful that his brokenness led to something good. The vault saved you. You built the foundation. I found purpose. That's not redemption exactly, but it's something. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell and stars emerged. Below, in the research center, lights glowed where scientists worked to save a species from extinction. In town, families slept in transitional housing, safe and warm because someone had decided they mattered. Across 3 counties, children received support because a man who'd failed his own son wanted to prevent other children from feeling that failure. Thomas Chen's legacy wasn't the $343 million, it was this. The ripples of salvation spreading outward from one desperate act of preparation, one vault hidden beneath disaster, one woman brave enough to look past the obvious, one son choosing to transform pain into purpose. 2 years later, the Mara Chen Conservation Foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary. The ballroom in Portland was packed with donors, scientists, families who'd been helped, and children from David's resilience program. Zoe, now 17, gave a speech about growing up at the facility, about learning that disaster and opportunity were often the same thing viewed from different angles, about understanding that her mother's desperation had become their salvation. David spoke too, his voice steady and clear. He talked about absent fathers and present systems, about learning that legacy wasn't what you left behind, but what you made possible for others. And Mara, standing at the podium for the final speech, looked out at the crowd and felt the weight of 10 years. The terror of that first night, the desperation that had driven them north through a blizzard, the moment of discovering life where everyone said only death remained. "We started with $400 and nowhere to go," she said. "We inherited disaster, leaking tanks and environmental violations, and a property worth less than a used car. Everyone told us to walk away, and we almost did." The room was silent, listening, but beneath the disaster, hidden where only the desperate would look, was something worth saving. Not just fish, not just money, but proof that giving up isn't the only option, that sometimes the worst inheritance possible is actually the greatest gift. She paused, composing herself. "In 10 years, we've helped 2,000 families avoid homelessness. We've provided 50,000 nights of emergency housing. We've granted $15 million in educational scholarships. We've released 1,500 juvenile sturgeon into the wild, pulling a species back from the edge of extinction. But the number that matters most to me is this. Zoe, David, and every child in our resilience program, they're growing up knowing they matter, knowing that adults show up, knowing that their circumstances don't define their worth." She looked at David, then at Zoe, both of them smiling through tears. Mara Chen built a vault and hid it beneath failure. He left it for whoever was desperate enough to find it. And in finding it, we didn't just save ourselves. We built something that will save people for generations. That's the legacy worth celebrating. Not the money, the message. You are worth saving, always. The applause was deafening. People stood, crying, clapping, holding each other. Mara saw Christina in the crowd, now a nurse manager at the university hospital, her daughter healthy and thriving. She saw families from the transitional housing, many of them stable now, passing forward the help they'd received. And she saw Dan, her first friend in this strange journey, wiping tears from his weathered face. After the ceremony, Mara, David, and Zoe stood outside in the cool evening air. "Uncle Thomas would have liked this," Zoe said, "seeing what his vault became. Would he?" David's voice carried old pain. He abandoned everything. Hard to say what he'd appreciate. Mara put a hand on his shoulder. "He'd appreciate that you chose differently, that you took his failure and transformed it into presence. That's the real redemption." They stood together, 3 people connected by disaster and salvation, by inheritance and transformation, by the understanding that sometimes broken people build perfect systems, and sometimes those systems save the people their creators couldn't. Above them, stars blazed in a clear sky. Below, the city hummed with life, and somewhere in a vault beneath a research facility on the Oregon coast, fish swam in perfect circles, preserving a species, generating hope, proving that hidden beneath disaster, salvation waits for those desperate enough to look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.